The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. So I just want to remind us that today, being the third Sunday of the month, it's the extended homily question-answer discussion. So I'm looking forward to really lively discussion. And I chose this reading because of the situation in our country right now and in our world right now. There's so much trauma, there's so much division, there's so much worry. So I've chosen a passage in which 6 different times Jesus mentions the word worry. And I've included a little statement of my own towards the end. And I want to see if you can pick up on it. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great will that darkness be? No one can serve 2 masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than the clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or stow away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? And why do you worry about clothes? See the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon, in all his splendor, was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here tomorrow and which is here today, and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? So do not worry saying, what will we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? Or whom shall we elect? But seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough worry of its own. Words inspired by God. About 30 years ago, in an Ivy League school back east, a series of what in my opinion were really horrific experiments were carried out to try to determine what the effects of the environment are on newborns. And so they chose kittens, newborn kittens, and they sequestered them over the period of months, different batches, and they raised them in different environments. So each group was raised in a big box, and they were being fed, obviously, but the only visual stimulation in the box here was vertical black lines painted about every 6 inches. For the first 6 months, that is all the kittens saw. In the other box over here, all the kittens saw visually were horizontal black lines about every 6 inches. And at the end of 6 months, when they let these kittens out into a normal environment, the ones that had been raised with the horizontal lines, they couldn't register vertical reality. They'd walk straight into the legs of chairs or tables. They couldn't see a vertical reality. The other guys who were raised with the vertical lines, they couldn't see horizontal reality, so they couldn't jump up onto a seat forever. And so, for me, what it demonstrates is that we don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. And if that's true of the mere sensorium, that how our eyes and our ears and our senses are developing during the formative years, it is even much more important of our perceptual mechanisms. So perception is what the mind or the brain does to sensory input. So we drink in information via our senses, but then it has to be processed. So the processing is what we call perception, and the perception leads to the actual experience. And the truth is that if you take, for instance, even vision, You can demonstrate now through neuropsychology, cognitive psychology, and through computer technology that about 50% of the visual images that appear on the occipital lobe, that's the part of the skull that registers visual phenomena. You take in information through the eyes, the brain processes it, it creates an image on the occipital lobe. Over 50% of the images that actually appear on the occipital lobe are not coming from the outside. They're being generated intracranially. They're being generated because of past experiences, hopes, fears, prejudice, etc. So you're taking information from the outside, whatever it is, you're massaging it, and you're creating even visual images which do not in fact correspond to what's out there. So we see things not so much as they are, we see things as we are. Now, this becomes very important then when we begin to look at our life situations, particularly when we're stressed in any way or when we're experiencing trauma of any kind. This realization to be able to differentiate between reality and what's made up. So I'm going to make 5 main points this morning. I'm going to talk firstly about differentiating real threat from perceived threat. That's the first point I'll make. Secondly, I want to talk about the actual mechanism of trauma. Thirdly, I want to talk about modern forms of trauma. Fourthly, I'm going to talk about something that I'm going to call the better angels of our nature. And then finally, I'm going to look at how do you heal trauma as an individual or as a nation. So the first one, differentiating between perceived threat and real threat. In the years that I lived in Kenya, I lived in an area of the Rift Valley where I was surrounded by all the big animals. There were elephant, there were giraffe, there were wildebeest, there were lion, there were leopard, there were cheetah, hippos, rhinos, all these animals. And occasionally I'd see a pride of lions making a kill. And one of their favorite targets was the wildebeest, these big, like antelope. And I'd watch them, and a herd of wildebeest would take off running once they spotted the lions. There might be 500 or 600 in the herd. And you could actually see that the eyes got bigger, and their chests are heaving, and they're running, and they're really panicking. And the lions coordinate their attack, and they bring down one of them. And the first thing the lion always goes for is the throat. One of them is going to catch it by the throat and squeeze so it can't breathe. And the animal is kicking furiously on the ground. And the other lions immediately go for the belly. They start literally gorging themselves on the viscera. They're opening up the animal, and their heads are stuck inside, and they're eating it. And the animal is still dying and kicking wildly. And what happens to the herd? The herd immediately stop running. I mean, you've got to see it to believe it. They realize the lions have made a kill. They're not going to make another kill today. And literally within 2 or 3 minutes, the pupils are no longer dilated. They're not breathing heavily. They're grazing. A whole herd are grazing. 100 yards away, one of their mates is being eviscerated. Now, that's because, animals know the difference between a perceived threat and a real threat. So when we're threatened, there's a whole bunch of physiological changes that happen for a human being. We go into a branch of the central nervous system, which is called the sympathetic nervous system, that allows us to do fight or flight. So there's a whole bunch of physiological stuff that happens there. Animals only go into that modality in the presence of real danger. Human beings are different. We human beings can go into that very same modality because of a remembered trauma from years and years and years ago, or from a futuristic scenario that we imagine. I remember one time having a client who came from Berkeley to see me as a psychologist, and she sat in the room and she said, I haven't been able to leave my house because I've been traumatized. And I said, what happened? Well, I was mugged. I said, where? I was walking down Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, and a man ran up to me and he grabbed my purse, which was over my shoulder, and we struggled for a few moments, and he knocked me to the ground and he ran off with my purse. And since then, I can't sleep at night. I'm afraid to go out. My life has changed. I'm saying, wow, I'm really, really sorry. And this mugging, how long did it last? She said, maybe 90 seconds, 2 minutes. I said, wow. And when did it happen? And I'm thinking she's going to say, 3 weeks ago. She said, 18 years ago. So this woman, because of a 90-second incident that happened 18 years ago, continues to traumatize herself. Because she keeps bringing that memory back again and again and again. And every time she does, she re-traumatizes herself. It's like you escape from a burning house. and then you keep running back into the burning house. What's going to happen? You get more and more damaged. So the difference between animals and ourselves is we don't know how to turn off this sympathetic nervous system and go back into parasympathetic, which is how we're supposed to live our lives. So there's a huge difference then between a perceived threat and a real threat. But for human beings, we cannot differentiate between them. We have the same physiological reactions to memories of old events or the fear of future events as we do to a presently occurring traumatic episode. So that's the very first thing to realize when we're talking about trauma of any kind, whether it's an individual trauma or a national trauma. It's the first point I want to make. Second point then, I want to look at the actual mechanism then, of what happens when a person is traumatized or feels really, really stressed out. Now, to understand this, we have to realize we have to go into evolutionary biology for a little bit. So the human brain consists of three very distinct parts. What's called the hindbrain, or the reptilian brain, and then the mammalian brain in the middle, or the limbic system, and then the front, the neocortex. And they all developed at very, very different stages of evolution. Once the first great multicellular creatures came on the scene, the reptiles, snakes and lizards and dinosaurs, whatever, their brain basically is about the functions necessary just to live. So the hindbrain, which is still at the back of the human skull, is in charge of all the vital functions like respiration, breathing, elimination, the endocrine system, putting energy into the muscles, dilating the pupils, etc. It's the functions we need for just basic survival. So that's been part of the setup for hundreds of millions of years. About 245 million years ago, with the advent of the mammals brought a whole new dimension to the brain. The limbic system, the part of the brain that could emote. Reptiles don't have emotions. Reptiles don't raise their young even. A turtle or a lizard lays eggs, and that's their commitment to family. That's it. For the first time ever, with the advent of the mammals, you had beings who actually looked after their young. And for the first time ever, you had creatures who could dream. You can watch a mammal, your cat or your dog, and they're actually dreaming. So for the first time ever, you have emotions. For the dinosaurs or lizards, there is a biological reaction to a dangerous situation, but there is no emotion attached to it, the situation. Only very, very recently in human evolution, less than 100,000 years ago, we developed the neocortex. And the neocortex is the part of us that is able to figure out chronology, timeline. It's the executive function. It's that which allows us to use language and to think abstractly and do stuff like mathematics. That is very, very, very recent. Now, the mechanism of trauma is this. When you're in a traumatic situation, you go straight to the hindbrain. You totally bypass the neocortex. You go straight to the hindbrain. And this is really, really important. If you're working in your kitchen and you inadvertently put your hand on top of a burning stove, if you didn't go straight to the hindbrain, if you had to go through the neocortex and you're saying, oh, I feel this strange sensation in my left hand and I smell something happening, I wonder what it is. Oh, my hand is on a hot stove. What should I do? Should I move this hand or that hand? What's the best way out of the situation? If you were to go through that neocortex, you'd be toast within 10 seconds. And so you go straight to the hindbrain in a traumatic situation. Your hand pulls away automatically. It totally bypasses the neocortex. It even bypasses the limbic system. Now, once it's made its adjustment, the limbic system kicks in. Now we have emotion, like fear or anger or something like that. But it doesn't go to the neocortex immediately. So the neocortex gets bypassed in situations like that. That's how the mechanism works. And what the hindbrain does, it floods the endocrine system with all kinds of important biochemicals, mainly cortisol and adrenaline, stuff like this, that mobilize the body for fight or flight. It's very important that it do that. So that bodily reaction is actually very appropriate. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to escape danger. But it comes at a huge cost, because most of these biochemicals that flood the system in a traumatic situation have a half-life of somewhere between 8 and 24 hours. So your system is flushed with that for a long period of time. So it is not the event that's creating the trauma. It's not the event. Two different people can witness the same event. One person is going to get traumatized and the other will not. What traumatizes you is the physiological release, the chemical cocktail that's suffused by your endocrine system into the body. That's what causes the stress. All stress is physiologically created. Now, once it's created, the emotions will react to what the body is doing, and now you're going to feel emotions attached to it. When it cools down a little bit, you may be able to kind of think about what's happened. But initially, the neocortex is totally offline. So when you're in a traumatic situation as an individual or as a community, your neocortex is offline. If you're in the grip of these biochemicals and these kinds of emotions, you're not thinking rationally, you're not speaking rationally, and you're not behaving rationally. So it becomes really, really important to understand, what's actually happening in your body. Now, as I say, it is really appropriate that when you're in the presence of a real danger, that the body react in that fashion. The problem is, perceived threat has the same effect on us. So let me use this as a dumb metaphor. So you're going out at night to drive, you're going to have to turn on your headlights. You're not going to be able to see without your headlights. So you do whatever you need to do, and then you come back home, and you park your car, and you turn off the lights. And you go in, and you're going to go to bed. Now, suppose every time you thought of your car, the lights automatically went on outside. And they stayed on for an hour. Every time you thought about it, they go on, and they stay on for an hour. What's your battery going to look like in the morning when you get up for work? You're not going to have one. It'll be totally dead. That's what happens in the presence of perceived threat. Every time we think about a bad thing that happened to us, or we think about a bad thing that could happen to us, we're turning on the lights of the car. And we go out in the morning to live our life, and there's no battery. We can't drive our car. That's what happens every time that we mistake a perceived threat for a real threat. We flood our system with this cocktail, this toxic cocktail of biochemicals, which are appropriate in real danger and not appropriate in just a perceived threat. So there's a huge difference between being safe and feeling safe. A lot of people are safe, but they don't feel it, and therefore they're awash in this toxic backlash. So that's my second point then, just looking at that's the mechanism of actual trauma. My third point then is I want to talk a little bit about new forms of trauma in our times. So historically, there have been different names for what happens to soldiers in battle situations and afterwards. You go back into the Swiss military, used to call it nostalgia. What we call now PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. They called it nostalgia. The German military used to call it homesickness. In the Civil War in our country, it was known as soldier's heart. In World War I, it was known as shell shock. In World War II, it was known as combat fatigue. And after the Vietnam War, we created a new term called post-traumatic stress disorder. But there's been versions of that all throughout human history. As long as humans have been in danger and experienced danger, we've been suffering from some version, whatever name we give to it. Now, this post-traumatic stress disorder, we begin by thinking the only people who suffer from PTSD are people who've actually been victims of some violent situation. So you experienced an earthquake, or you were in a war situation in combat, or you were mugged, or you were involved in an auto accident, and so you have an actual memory, an actual event that happened and triggered this situation. And for a long period of time, psychology just treated that. They regarded, PTSD only happened with people who had experienced real traumatic events in their lives. Very recently, the DSM, the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's the Bible of the psychological community. It's about 1,600 pages of a huge big volume of a book. And there have been 5 different versions of it over the last 30 or 40 years. The most current version, DSM-5, includes a new form of PTSD. It's called PTSD by witness. You don't actually have to be a victim in a situation to suffer PTSD because of an occurrence. So, for instance, first responders, we see a lot of evidence. Firemen who are called out again and again, police officers at auto scenes, ER staff in hospitals who are dealing with crisis after crisis after crisis, even investigative journalists who go out investigating accidents or suicides or whatever. These people suffer extraordinary amounts of PTSD. So now there's a whole new diagnosis in the DSM-5 that you can suffer PTSD from being a witness to an event. You were not a victim of it in the strict sense of the word, but you are a victim one stage removed because you witnessed a single event or several or many events. Now, I have a belief system that they didn't quite get the whole story, because I think there's a third form of PTSD, and in my opinion, it is the most prevalent form of all. It's not PTSD because you were a victim. It's not PTSD because you were a witness. It's PTSD via the mass media. As a psychologist, I would say that maybe 5% of the threat that people report to me, is actually real dangerous situations that they've been in. I would say 95% is perceived threat, but they cannot differentiate between them, and so there's this physiological, wash of chemicals that flood them. Now, if you were to ask me, what is the single greatest source of perceived threat? Without a shadow of a doubt, I would say the mass media. The mass media, the whole system is calculated to keep us on edge constantly. It's like by watching the night news, we may as well be mainlining anxiety and fear and anger. So again and again and again, people are being traumatized. And it's the same system. You start off with the news, which is not news. They're cherry-picking stuff they want you to be upset about. And then they present it to you. And then you see a perceived threat in the news line. Your body is flooded with all these chemicals. You have an emotional reaction, and your neocortex goes offline. You can now no longer see the other point of view or the other person's situation. You're just flooded, and you then react either in your thinking, in your speaking, or in your behavior according to this. And this cycle goes on again and again and again. And we go back night after night after night, and we subject ourselves. We walk straight back into the burning building, and then we worry. We're concerned about, why am I feeling anxious? Why am I on medications? Why am I depressed? Why am I enraged by the situation? Because you keep coming back into the same burning house again and again and again. It's almost like we're being like sheep. We can't get enough of that which we don't want. It's almost as if, either we're totally dumb or we're card-carrying masochists. Why would we go back to that stuff again and again and again with the same result happening again and again and again? So for me, easily the greatest cause of perceived threat, which leads to real anxiety, real fear, real anger, and real rage, is the news media. So as long as we keep, going back into the burning house, we're going to have that. That's my third point. My fourth point I'm going to call the better angels of our nature. And that's a phrase actually from Abe Lincoln, the better angels of our nature. But WHO, the World Health Organization, conducted a huge study over several years in every country of the world. And they're trying to figure out, this safety level of particular cultures and nations. And they looked at 15 different indices. They looked at crime, they looked at warfare, they looked at disease, they looked at famine, all of these indices of why people might feel unsafe. And they spent years and years and years gathering all those data. And then they divided it up into three groupings. They looked at countries that had high incomes, countries that had medium income, and countries that had low income. And what they found out was, we live in the safest time in human history. If you're part of a medium or a higher income culture, you live in the safest period of human history. If you're in the lower group, not quite so. There has never been a stage of human history that's actually being safer for you. But there's a big difference between being safe and feeling safe. Our grandparents had experienced much more trauma in their lives than we do. But we witness a lot more trauma than they did. And we're witnessing it vicariously through the mass media. So there were the findings of the WHO, the World Health Organization internationally. There has never been a safer period of world history if you're in a kind of medium income or a higher income culture. Now, there's a psychologist in Harvard University, brilliant guy, called Steven Pinker, Canadian, and he's been studying this in much, much more depth over a longer period of time. And he wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he's looked at, all of the factors that create distress or trauma for human beings. And he examined the evidence going back way before history into archaeological evidence, looking at, for instance, sites of battles that had been excavated. He looked at world literature, like Homer's Odyssey or the scriptures. And then he started looking at strict history itself, where there are historical, verifiable accounts. And he's come to the conclusion that there's been extraordinary diminution, lessening of violence all throughout human history. If you take a long enough viewpoint, there are spikes occasionally. It has never been safer to be a human being than it is now. So I've taken his work and I've divided it up into 4 categories just to present you with a few kind of figures, give you some sense of what he's saying. So I looked at his figures and I looked at what does it say about international conflict? What does it say about national conflict? What does it say about community conflict? And what does it say about individual conflict? And here are just a few figures off the top of my head looking at his work. He's making the claim that from the archaeological evidence that predates any historical record, it's obvious that there's been a huge decline in the amount of violence between nations or between warring tribes. So, for instance, looking at the archaeological evidence from battle scenes, it would appear that in any battle in ancient times, something like 16% of the combatants were actually killed in the course of the battle. 16%. In the 20th century, in spite of World War I and World War II, the combatants killed in battle was 4%. So literally a quarter of what the old figures were, in spite of the numbers. What he finds out is that, if you look, for instance, since the end of World War II, so 1946 onwards, there has been no battle between the United States and Russia. Nobody has dropped a nuclear bomb on anybody in a battle situation. Europe, in Western Europe, in the 600 years preceding 1945, there was an average of 2 wars going on at any one time in Europe, among European nations against each other. For the 600-year period up to 1945, there was an average of at least 2 wars being conducted every single year between 2 European nations. Since 1946, there has been no war between European nations. In fact, when you look at the developed world, there has been no war between developed nations since 1953. Most of the wars you look at are civil wars within the countries. So there's this huge drop in actual violence through warfare. You look at the notion of genocide and you say, it's never been worse than the 20th century. You had the Armenian genocide about 1918. You had the Holocaust in Germany, in the 1940s. You had the Rwanda situation, in the late 1990s. Terrible genocide wiped out. When you look at the historical record, you look at the history, the written history of the Akkadian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire, genocide was the normal way in which battles ended. It wasn't that just the combatants killed some of each other, they wiped out everybody. All you have to do is to read the book of Exodus again and again and again. God commands us to wipe out every man, every woman, every child. So you wiped out all living beings. And then sometimes you had to kill the cattle as well, but sometimes you were allowed to keep the cattle. The normal way that battles ended was genocide. We have been practicing genocide as a human community since the beginning. Now, when you hear about genocide, we're shocked at what happened in Armenia. We're shocked about what happened in Germany in the 40s. We're shocked about what happened in Rwanda. We're absolutely shocked that this could occur in our world. If we had lived 2,000 years ago, this would have been, how things happen. That's how wars end. You wipe out everybody. So there's a huge diminution in genocide. So that's just looking at at an international stage. When you look at violence then within the national psyche of people, in the United States of America, before the beginning of the 20th century, there were 90 crimes punishable by the death penalty. 90 different crimes. We're not talking about doing murder yourself. We're talking about 90 different crimes which were punished by the death penalty, including stealing, including sodomy, including witchcraft. So these are all punished by the death penalty. 90 different kinds of crimes punished by the death penalty. Now, there's one in some states. Committing murder will get you killed. But there's 1 out of 91 possible. You look at Europe. Europe used to have 52 countries in Europe had a death penalty. Now, not a single one has the death penalty. So the idea at a nation that we can kill people for crimes is totally passé. You look at the notion of torture. Torture was an accepted way in which government dealt with dissidents. Torture was totally accepted. Nobody batted an eyelid. So we're not doing that. When you hear now about incidents of torture, you're totally shocked that this could be going on in our world and in our time. So that has diminished hugely. So when you look as well at the national level, you look at stuff like dueling, that the gentry had the right to shoot each other, or take out their rapiers and kill each other. That was commonly accepted. Our hunting witches was commonly accepted. We don't do that anymore. Our blood sports, where you kill animals for fun, that's almost gone at this stage. So you look at local communities, and you look at, for instance, something like lynching. In 1880, in our country, there were 150 different people killed by lynching. And one of the most upsetting photographs I've ever seen in my life, photography had just been invented, is a photograph of two guys hanging off a tree and a huge crowd gathered around in their Sunday best, women and children, and they're smiling for the camera as these two guys are dangling in the background. Today, there aren't any, at least there are no official lynchings going on. So there's a huge diminution of that kind of stuff. And then, as far as one-on-one killing is concerned, in medieval Europe, 1 in 1,000 people would wind up being the victim of a homicide. 1 in 1,000 in medieval Europe. Today it's down to 1 in 100,000. So it's 100 times less likely, if you live in Europe, to be killed by an individual act of murder today than if you lived in the Middle Ages. So all of these factors are going down. When you look at the other side, what's improving, you look at the improvement in rights, civil rights, women's rights, children's rights, gay rights, animal rights, all these things have improved. You look, for instance, at the average IQ has gone up 15 points in the last 100 years. And if you look at literacy, between 1625 and 1925 in England, the literacy rate went from 5% of the population to 98% of the population. So by all these parameters, we've never lived in safer times. But you wouldn't know that from watching the mass media. You are safer, but you don't feel safer. In fact, we're making our kids scared of life because of what's being presented to us. And why would this be? What is the agenda about scaring people and making people anxious? Look at who might be benefiting from this outcome. And the first thing is the pharmaceutical industry. If people aren't depressed and anxious and bipolar, there's a whole loss of income there. So it's important to keep us on a whole bunch of drugs. It becomes very important for the military-industrial complex. How are we going to justify spending, $2 billion on a B-52 bomber, of which we have more than we need, if we can't make people afraid? What is our prison industrial system going to do? The prison industry, and it is an industry now, states no longer are responsible for incarcerating people. It's an industry. It's now a $100 billion industry where the states have to guarantee to these private organizations that they will give them at least 90% occupancy. And if they fall short of it, the state has to make up the shortfall in a subsidy. So they're benefiting, obviously. So the psychologists are benefiting. A lot of psychologists would be out of a job if there were less anxiety, and less depression in the world. So there's a whole bunch of people who are benefiting from the fact of keeping us on edge. But primarily, the single most important reason for keeping us on edge is you can control a population that's afraid. We appeal to them, save us from the terrorists, save us from the Russians, save us from the Democrats, save us from the Republicans, whatever it is. By making people afraid, you can now propose draconian solutions in order to keep them safe, and they're going to feel safe, but they're going to trade their civil rights for it. There's an agenda behind all that. And every time you walk into the burning house, you're subscribing to that. Every time you turn on a talking head making you angry against somebody else, you're subscribing to that. So who's benefiting? You're not benefiting. The world isn't benefiting. You were never safer, but you've never felt less safe. That's my fourth point. So that's all the bad news out of the way. What's the good news? Healing trauma. How do you go about healing trauma? So I'm going to divide this into two pieces. If you want to consult, for instance, a psychologist about PTSD or really kind of traumatic stuff in your life, here's what a trained psychologist who's been trained specifically in PTSD therapy will attempt to do with you. The first stages, and the very important stage, is there has to be a rapport between the client and the therapist in which the client feels loved and secure, really liked and loved by the therapist. It can't be in a hostile situation. No therapy is going to be effective there. So that's the first thing. It becomes really important for the therapist to create a loving, trusting environment where the person feels safe and seen. That's the first thing. The second thing is you have to begin a kind of a psychoeducation. You have to lead the person through a little bit of what I've just done at the beginning, the mechanisms of trauma. That trauma happens because of the hindbrain, the limbic system, the neocortex, the flood of chemicals into your system, that's totally appropriate if you're in real danger, but you're going to run down your battery if it's not appropriate. You have to educate the person in the reality, the psychoeducation of what's happening within them. The next thing you have to teach them, there's a big word, interoception. Interoception is the felt sense of my own body, whether I feel tense and anxious or whether I feel relaxed. It's called in psychology interoception. The ability in real time to monitor the state of arousal of your own body. You know, where in my body am I feeling tension right now? The ability to immediately be able to say, oh God, I'm feeling really anxious in my stomach or my shoulders are hunched. Immediately. And following upon that is self-regulation. The ability to change that, because what's happening, if your body is stressed, it means you're flooded with these chemicals. There is a way to kind of shorten the half-life of that process. Various exercises, and I'll propose a few to you at the very, very end of this. There are ways in which you can intervene and self-regulate so that you can get out of that kind of a cocktail of chemicals. And then once the therapist has established that you now have the ability to self-monitor and self-regulate, now you can examine the original trauma and you can deal with it now. You're not in a burning house trying to deal with the trauma of being in a burning house. You're in a safe house remembering and dealing with the residual damage created by having been in a burning house. But you're in a safe place to do it. You cannot be traumatized, I repeat that for you, you cannot be traumatized in a body in which the muscles are relaxed. You can't. It's impossible. If your muscles are relaxed, you cannot be traumatized. If you're in a muscle-relaxed body, you cannot be traumatized right then. PTSD cannot coexist with a totally relaxed body. So that's the big kind of giveaway. So that's what would happen if you were to go into therapy with somebody trained in that modality. But for most of us, we can do this on our own. So how do you go about yourself? How do you go about dealing with the amount of trauma and anxiety that you're feeling? You know, I'm going to, the very, very first thing you need to do, in my opinion, is you have to get out of the burning house. Stop re-traumatizing yourself. Because every time you look at a newscast, you're being re-traumatized. You're being invited to flood your body with these chemicals. You're being invited to bypass your neocortex. You're being invited into your emotional center where you're going to feel anger or anxiety or even rage against something. You're being invited into that. If you keep re-traumatizing yourself, don't expect that the anxiety will ever diminish or that the fears will ever dissolve. So the most important thing you can do for yourself, if you've been traumatized, don't go back into the burning house. Now, there's a whole bunch of other exercises then, you know, that help you to actually self-regulate. Firstly, you have to develop the ability of interoception. You have to, on a regular basis, and I don't mean once a week, I mean maybe 2 or 3 times an hour, just quick scan your body. Am I tense someplace? And if I'm tense, how do I relax the tension? And you've all learned many techniques. There are ways of doing it. Deep breathing, diaphragmatic breathing can do it. Muscle tensing, by consciously tensing the muscle, start at your head and go down to your toes, consciously tense each muscle sequentially and then relax it intentionally. Go right through your whole body. You can do that. The single most effective one, according to the research, is called relaxing the pelvic floor. And very, very briefly what it means is, if you were sitting down, you put your hands under your backside, there are 2 sit bones down there. And if you put your hands on your hips, there's 2 more bones there. If you were to draw a rectangle between those 4 bones, it's called the pelvic floor. According to the research is, if you can relax your pelvic floor every single other muscle in your body will relax. You can't be tensed anywhere else in your body if the pelvic floor is relaxed. So to consciously be able to bring your attention down there on a regular basis, every 2 or 3 minutes, even when you're in the middle of a conversation, what's happening down there? Relax it. You can't be tense. You can't be stressed. You can't have PTSD if the pelvic floor is relaxed. But the most important one I'm going to offer you is this. Prayer. Real prayer. And it's not prayer for yourself, but altruistic prayer for others. The ability to reach out from your own distress and bring somebody else in your attention and pray for that person. Not just friends even, enemy figures. The most important way you will deal with trauma is bringing enemy figures into your attention and praying for them. If you're a Democrat, you take a Republican in. If you're a Republican, you take a Democrat in and you pray. And you're not praying that they see the light and that they come around to your way of thinking. That's not prayer. That's mental colonialism. It's not prayer. You think that you're going to bend somebody else to your purpose and bring them around so they see the light and they join in your group? Yeah, that's in some senses, it's like in business language, it's like a hostile takeover masquerading as a spiritual exercise. That is not prayer. Prayer is where, as Jesus pointed out, you pray for the enemy figure and you're deadly serious. And if you really know your stuff, you're hoping that the enemy figure is concurrently praying for you. That person is not trying to bend you to make you a Republican of a Democrat, or you're not trying to bend a Democrat to become a Republican. You're literally praying for the most benevolent outcome for everybody. You're totally elevating away above the fray. You're not trying to convert anybody. You're trying to learn and grow in compassion and unconditional love. I really believe that we're at a stage of world history, and maybe it's at a crisis stage in our country right now, but when you look at evolutionary biology, even at a geological level, there is never a significant shift in consciousness which is not, created by some kind of a crisis. It happens even globally, literally to the physical planet itself. It happens on an individual basis in your own journey in life, happens in the life of our nation, and it happens in the life of our species. There has never been a significant shift in human consciousness which was not precipitated by some kind of a crisis. We've gone from a place of barbarity where genocide was the normal conclusion to battles to a place where it's horrific. We've made some extraordinary shifts in the past. We're being invited now, our generation is being invited to make the next shift, to move from Homo sapiens sapiens into Homo spiritualis, to move into a Christ consciousness. I think we have a glorious opportunity as individuals within this nation right now, not to look at this political Punch and Judy show as a reason for getting upset and anxious and angry, but of a way of extending ourselves into a Christ consciousness where we hold everybody in unconditional love and ask God to bring about the next stage of human progress. Namaste, brothers. So let's open it up for discussion.
I thank you for bringing those to our attention, because I think individually a lot of us recognize that we are being manipulated, and I hear a lot of the wisdom of certainly not starting your day or ending your day with the news. However, there are two things that I can speak for myself, and I would say that many people share the same concerns. And one of them is simply the deterioration of truth in our lives, regardless of who you want to blame, which political problem, doesn't seem to be any respect for truth, and it has become like the way it is. And the second one is people have really recognized and reacted to the way children have been separated from their families. And that started out with the whole idea with DACA. And then it's continued to the whole immigration system and how people it's been dehumanized, it'd be the word. And I think those two things, for me personally, and for many people, are what is upsetting us the most.
Okay, great comments. So here's my response to it. I'm personally not interested in getting into the details of any particular issue, because when we get into the details, we're taking sides. The truth for me is a different issue than, for instance, separating kids. The whole education system in this country, beginning in 1852 in Massachusetts, which forced education, where kids were taken from homeschooling and forced into a system at gunpoint, was the beginning of separating children from their grandparents, their parents, and life on the farm, whatever. So we've been separating kids in this country at this stage now for over 150 years. But let me get to the truth piece. I agree with you completely on that one. And my belief system is that we have mistaken truth for fact. There's a huge difference between fact and truth. I've said this to you many times. Something can be factual but not true, and something can be true but not factual. I'll give you an example. So for instance, it's now, what's up there, 10:43, whatever, that's a fact. Is that life transforming to you? Probably not. My definition of truth is that something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God. And something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with God. So even if it's not factual, and my favorite example, I've run it by you before, is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Christ has been interrogated by his audience, and somebody says to him, "Who is my neighbor?" And he says, "Okay, there was a certain man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was mugged, and he was left dying at the side of the road. And about an hour later, a priest from the temple was passing by. He saw a fellow Jew there, and he ignored him because he didn't want to be contaminated. Priests weren't allowed to touch dead bodies, so he just kept going. An hour later, a Levite from the temple came. The Levites were the temple police, like they were sacristans, policemen for the temple. He went down, he saw a fellow Jew at the side of the road, and he ignored him because he didn't want to get contaminated as well. Some hours later, a Samaritan came down. And the modern equivalent would be like a Palestinian encountering an Israeli at the side of the road. Picked him up, tended to him, put him on his donkey, took him down to Jericho, checked into a hotel, paid his bill, and then Christ said at the end, "Which of these was neighbour to the man who was mugged?" Now, if you were a reporter from the Jerusalem Post, you said, "There's something fishy about this story." Yeah, I don't believe it. And you go to the temple, you interview the high priest, you interview the Levites, you go down to Jericho, there's only 6 hotels in Jericho, you interview all the hotel managers, and you ask, did this really happen? That a Palestinian took a dying Israeli, checked into a hotel, paid his bill? Did that happen? No way. I certainly would have remembered that. And you come back up to Jesus Christ, you said that was a crock. Never happened. Now, did it happen? Maybe it never did. Was it true? Absolutely. Because anybody who heard that story and understood that story was radically transformed. So truth is about that which transforms us. Anything, even if it's factual, and I hear your point that most of this actually isn't even factual. So not only is it not true, it's not even factual. And it certainly isn't inspirational. It's calculated to set us at each other's throats. So we need to go back more and more and more, beyond even getting rid of fake news. That's a first step. But beyond getting rid of fake news is the establishment of the reality that something is really only true if it transforms you and aligns you with love and aligns you with God. Johanna.
I'm really, really grateful that you've given us these methods of backing down our cortisol levels or whatever that contributes to us staying stressed. And I have 2 sort of questions. One is that if we're in a situation where a crisis occurs that can be dangerous, and I've been in that, where it's not myself, it's somebody else, and you leap right into the taking care of, and then that would be like for ER, doctors, nurses, police, things like that. They're trained to leap even though it's not them. So you'll go right into the cognizant area of your brains. But then later on, hours later, can come the part where you go into your emotions, and then you're exhausted. Does that seem to be true? That's part 1.
Let me just respond to that question.
Sure.
You can ask the second piece then. My understanding is actually that firefighters, first responders, and nurses, this is not their spontaneous reaction. The spontaneous reaction in a trauma situation is to flood with cortisol. They have to be trained to overcome that. They have to be trained to stay centered, to respond in an appropriate fashion. There's a whole protocol that they will go through. And then later, they may have to deal with their own, the truth, Susie? Yeah. Susan is an ER nurse, an OR nurse. People have to be trained to get in that modality. But there is a long-term cumulative residual effect, even for first responders and even for doctors and nurses, where they're having to deal with the fact that they have to set aside their own need right now out of a sense of love and duty, but they're having to deal with the fact that, they were flooded with material that they had to somehow supersede and act anyway. Like Mother Teresa's poem today, love anyway. Reach out anyway, be compassionate anyway, in spite of, what's coming at you. Right. So this is trained. These people are trained to override their instinct and to go straight for the altruistic helping of others.
I used to be a labor and delivery nurse in inner city Philadelphia.
Okay.
And women would come in spontaneous labor because they were drug addicts and they had just taken drugs. And you have to, not even think about the judgment of what you're doing, what happened with that woman prior to this. You just have to kick into the safety and security of her and the baby.
Totally.
So you don't even really engage in any kind of trauma or judgment or anything. Right. You just take care of it. And then, you do get flooded with cortisol after a traumatic event.
Absolutely.
And then you have to deal with it.
Thank you. Thanks a minute. What was the second part, Johanna?
Well, I was going to say that I have been in those experiences later, so that's normal too, that later on in the day or
Absolutely.
the next day.
Absolutely.
So then my second question is having to do with some of the pieces you've given us to take care of this. Is meditation a way to
Yes,
do that?
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. So I made a long list of exercises that actually can help out. I'll just mention a few more. Meditation is huge. I think prayer, the two most important ones, I really believe, is get out of the burning house, stop looking at the news, and stop re-traumatizing yourself. And the last one, prayer, altruistic prayer for the most benevolent outcome. Not to be a mental colonialist, but to actually have everybody, move into a place of compassion. In between those are a whole bunch of other ones, like the pelvic floor exercise, or like diaphragmatic breathing, or like even peripheral vision. For instance, if you stare at a spot on the wall, focus intently on the spot on the wall, and then relax your focus and start taking in the peripheral images, your body instinctively relaxes. So there's a whole bunch of other techniques that you can learn. Meditation is a huge one. Body techniques like, yoga and stuff like that, qigong, stuff like that. There's a lot of different techniques that can help you, relax the body. But the important really lesson is that it's the physiology, the biochemistry that's traumatizing you. It's not the event. It's not a mental picture. It's the physiological release. And unless you deal with the physiological release, you're wasting your time trying to sort out the event.
Would you go over that last thing about looking there?
So I'm just looking at, tried and trusted methods of actually relaxing the body physically. Yeah? And I've mentioned a whole bunch on the pelvic floor, diaphragmatic breathing. There's a simple one as well called peripheral vision. If you stare at an object on the wall, let's say this picture over there, and you focus, let's say, on the blue part of it, and then you relax your vision and you begin looking peripherally. I can see somebody walking, leaving the church right now. I'm sorry, you're bored. Yeah? Or I can see the candle to my right. So peripherally, I'm looking, at different areas. Now, you're engaging different parts of the eye. You have cones at the center of the eye that look for color, and rods at the side that look for night vision. It's like your night vision goggles. So when you're taking visual information in peripherally, your body is relaxed more than when you're focused narrowly.
Could you give an example of a prayer that you would say for an enemy?
Uh-huh.
And then can you heal those parts of the brain?
Yes.
Yourself?
Okay, you can. What prayer would you say for an enemy? I can think of no better example. When I look, for instance, at the image of Christ's 7 last words on the cross, and I've tried to arrange them in some kind of a chronological fashion, because you've got 1 in Mark, you've got 1 in Matthew, you've got 3 in Luke, and you've got 2 in John, and they're all mixed together. So there's 7 discrete ones. He starts off on the cross, and he's totally aware of his own psychological trauma. He says, my God, why have you abandoned me? So firstly, he's focused on his own mental trauma. The second one is, he now focuses on his own physical discomfort. He says, I am thirsty. Right? So he's now on his physical thirst. Now he begins to kind of look outside himself. There are two other guys crucified with him. One of them is berating him, and the other guy says, stop, please stop that. We deserve to die. He doesn't deserve to die. And he says to Christ, well, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Christ's response is, today you will be with me in paradise. So now he's reaching out and forgiving a fellow sufferer. Then he sees his mother and Mary Magdalene and John the Beloved, and he can imagine what are they suffering watching this happen, this debacle. And he says, son, behold your mother, mother, behold your... He's making sure that his mother is going to be taken care of. So now he's extended himself out for his family. And then he looks at what's happening at the foot of the cross. Soldiers are playing dice for the garment that his mother wove for him. The high priest is taunting him. If you really are the Messiah, come down off the cross, and then we'll believe in you. And Christ's response is, Father, forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. And then at the end of that, he's able to say, it is completed. I've finished what I came to do. Into your hands I commend my spirit. That is the prayer of forgiveness.
I just didn't know how, could you use the words if you were praying for an enemy of yourself? What would be the words you would say?
So,
what would I say to them?
It's not so the words, it's the intention. You can formulate it in verbiage, or you can just hold the intention in your heart. To take somebody, you take him into your heart. It is a child of God. This person is a child of God as much as I am or you are. Hold them in a loving heart space. When you're soothing a little infant, you don't have to talk to the child. The fact that you're holding a little baby to your heart is all the baby needs. And you can start singing lullabies. You can croon. That's bonus territory.
You don't have to think anything or say anything.
No. In your heart, in your vision, bring him into your heart, in your space.
And then can you hear your brain?
Yeah, your brain will follow on, because the heart is in some senses is moved by the hindbrain. The neocortex came much later.
You can think about healing that?
If you want to, as long as you're doing the action, you can think about it and make sense of it later.
But yourself, heal your own brain.
Yes, right. So Andrea was next, and then Chris, and then Lawrence. Andrea.
Oh, thank you so much, Father Sean, for your incredible homily. I loved every moment of it. I have a comment and a question. So my comment is, of the 4 modalities for healing PTSD, I just want to add on the first one, get out of the house, is also not just mass media, but also the story that you tell yourself over and over again, because, as you said with the first story, in Buddhism, they actually have a thing called the first arrow is the incident, but the second and third arrows are actually worse. And the second and third arrows are the stories that you create around the actual event. So there's a physiological event that happens that lasts 2 minutes. But then the story and the emotions that you carry and you keep remembering, that's the part that is really important to get away from.
Let me just make one comment on that before you address your question. The Buddha went on to say that pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional.
Yes.
Pain is the event that happens with your physiological, aftermath. Suffering is the stories we make up about the pain we just experienced.
Exactly.
And 95% of human discomfort is suffering. It's not pain. It's not the event. It's what we did, the interpretations and the stories. Okay, sorry, you had a question then.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, it's the attachment to the suffering in the story. I guess my question is just, what about distortions of reality? For example, my older daughter is, she has trauma about me, for example, which makes no sense because I've done nothing but love her my whole life. But my house is like the burning house, so she can never come home, or she can't even see me. She blocks me. She can't even talk to me. It makes no sense. It's not based in reality. So,
okay. So that's a fascinating point to make, Andrea. And the problem is, there is no such thing as reality. Reality is an artifact created by our sensorium with this very, very narrow range of abilities. We can only see between infrared and ultraviolet. We can only hear between 20 and 20,000 hertz. Every one of them is limited. And then we do all kinds of processing in our minds. So there is no such thing as ultimate reality. Every time you fish out a memory from your past, you massage it unintentionally. Every time you take it out, it's going to be slightly different. It will grow a little bit or it'll diminish a little bit. If you leave memories there and don't recover them, they'll evolve, they'll dissolve a little bit. So no matter what you do with the memory, it's going to affect your reality model. So your daughter's version of reality is totally true for her, and your version of reality is totally true for you. I know this growing up in a large family. We sometimes talk about events of childhood, and I say, do you remember when? And Shima says, that never happened. This is what happened here. Really? So we lose memories by not bringing them back, and we lose memories by taking them, because we massage them every time we take them back out to re-examine them. Chris was next, and then we'll finish with Lawrence. Chris.
The first is on the media, and your comments on that, like going back into a burning building and so forth. That's a good point, but we still need to be informed. So I think there's a fine line there, and I think it's different for each person, how much we can digest and how much brings us into trauma.
There's a huge difference between being informed, being misinformed, and being disinformed. Yeah. Informed is people are dealing with the facts. Misinformed is people misunderstand the facts and give us unintentionally things which aren't factual. And disinformation is trading in stuff they know is not factual. You have to distinguish between your source. Is it really factual? Is it misinformation that they've just made a mistake in reporting? Or is it disinformation where there's actually an agenda to lead you in the wrong way?
A challenge I've always had with the focus on today, tomorrow will look after itself teaching, is it seems to me if one's not careful, it easily leads to a feeling of no need to act, a feeling of complacency, a lack of action. I personally happen to believe that now is a time where I massively need to act. So I spend some time trying to think on what basis. You know, while I can't quite eliminate the rage that I feel, I am trying to act from a place of calmness, a place of perhaps love, but certainly a place of community, of working with people. But I don't want to treat these, this mode of thinking as a, well, therefore don't act, because, you know, action is coming from all these wrong emotions and replaying things. I think action is key in my worldview.
I totally agree with you. I'm not promoting on a lack of action. What I'm saying is that we need to use the present and we need to harvest the past for lessons learned in order to understand the trajectory, and we need to plan for the future. But we can't live in the past and we can't live in the future. We can use the now, you know, creatively to understand where we've come from and therefore to kind of guess where we might be headed. And if we like where we're headed, great. If we don't like where we're headed, we need to take action now. But it's done from an elevated space where we're looking for God's timing and God's methodology rather than me imposing my timing and my method on it. Of course, we're called to action. We're called to action in interpersonal relationships. We're called to action in social situations. We're called to action politically. We're called to action globally. The question is, am I, you know, in that position, am I open to hearing other perspectives, and am I trying to create some kind of a synthesis of viewpoints? Because in any situation, if there are 50% of the population who are good people, intelligent people, people of integrity, and on the other side are 50% of the people who are good people, intelligent people, people of integrity, there must be some value to each side. I'm far better served by trying to figure out what's the gem that they have that I didn't yet figure out, rather than try to impose my system on those. So the action has to come from a place of humility, and in some senses, while I'm taking action, realizing that it's God's timing and it's God's method that will make this come about. Yeah.
I'd like to applaud Father Sean and your amazing knowledge of the physiology of the central nervous system, because it took me
this is coming from a doctor.
many years, okay. Repeated lectures to understand about the physiology of the brain, which is an amazing organ. And you're so amazing the way you explained it. Was so, everything you said was just very genuine. And regarding the news could be good, news could be bad, it could be negative, especially with the negative videos that accompanies it. Maybe the milder way of listening or understanding the news is reading the newspaper, because you have a control. You know when to stop. With the news, you have to keep listening, or you have to turn off your TV.
Right.
Beautiful things, beautiful view, beautiful pictures can heal.
Absolutely.
And I would recommend, because there's a book written by Dr. Esther Sternberg of University of Minnesota. Okay. The name is Dr. Esther Sternberg, okay, author of The Healing Spaces, okay, which is very true. It has been proven, it has healed people, whether they have any kind of illness. And I'm just so proud to inform the community that my daughter Annika has a project with Stanford University. She's been discussing this project of healing center at the university, at Stanford University, and she'll be presenting it by the end of the year. And this is not just for Stanford, not just for the staff, not just for the students, but hopefully it'll spread throughout the world. So just to inform you, again, read Dr. Esther Sternberg, author of Healing Spaces, because you'll learn a lot from it. If you look at beautiful pictures, beautiful views, beautiful flowers, it will be part of your healing, whether it's emotional, physical, or physiological illness. Thank you, Father.
Thank you so much, and thank you for giving us your daughter. Both of you guys, thanks a million. So before we continue with our Eucharist, let's offer each other a sign of our peace.